Hi, and welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thank you for tuning in today. If you enjoy our conversation series, make sure that you subscribe to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and like us on Facebook to watch our latest interviews. And of course, be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our humanitarian and advocacy efforts across the globe. In my conversation today, I'll be speaking with Professor of Archaeology Jennie Ebeling about her invaluable work piecing together the nuances of life in ancient Israel and Jordan. She has excavated archaeological sites across the Middle East, helping paint a more complete picture of how people ate, drank, worshipped, and went about their daily lives in biblical times. A professor at the University of Evansville in Indiana, Ebeling has been working on archaeological projects in Israel and Jordan for over 25 years. In addition to co-directing the Jezreel Expedition in Israel from 2012 to 2018, Ebeling focuses on and studies ancient food and drink technology, women in antiquity, and religion in Canaan and ancient Israel. She's also conducted ethnographic research on traditional bread making in Jordan and produced several videos on the subject. She earned an MA and a PhD in Near Eastern Studies from the University of Arizona, a former Fulbright scholar. She was awarded fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Lady Davis Trust to support research in Israel and Jordan. She's the co-editor of several publications, most recently contributed to the fourth edition of Ancient Israel from Abraham to the Roman Destruction of the Temple, which was published in 2021. Jennie, welcome, and thanks for being here today.
Hi, thank you very much, Dan. I'm really happy to be here with you.
Well, I mentioned in my introduction that you study ancient food and drink technology, women in antiquity, and religion in ancient Israel. But before I ask you what drew you to those areas and to the role of women in biblical times, I have to ask you about how you got interested in this field.
Well, I grew up in an area in Maryland where I had the opportunity to visit a lot of historical sites, as well as museums. And I mean, this is one of my fondest memories of my youth when we took school trips to the Smithsonian museums and, and other places around the area. And, I was totally fascinated by ancient Egypt as a kid, as a lot of kids are. And later, Greece and Rome and sort of the kind of archaeology that is most available, I guess, through, children's books. And at that time, like videos and things like that. It's changed since then. So I wanted to pursue archaeology. I wanted to study it in college, and I ended up doing just that. And that led me to spend a semester in Israel when I was a junior in college, and that sort of sealed the deal. That was the archaeology that fascinated me the most, and I continued on from there.
We think we know, but I'm going to ask you as an archaeologist, because that's would be the fount of information here. What role does archaeology play in reconstructing life in biblical times?
Now, this is a great question. So we have so many sources available to us to understand, daily life, what most people were up to on a daily basis. And certainly, the text is a big part of that. But it's limited because, the biblical writers were not into giving us a handbook of daily life in ancient Israel. We only get, bits and pieces and anecdotes and settings for stories and things like that. So it's really, archaeology that provides sort of limitless information about these sorts of things. And, archaeologists study, the past through the remains that people left behind. So, I mean, we've got at archaeological sites in Israel and elsewhere, just, the remains of houses, that maybe unfortunately were destroyed, and the roofs caved in and it sealed all the things, that they left in their houses. So, I mean, just that alone is just a treasure trove about daily life, what people were eating and drinking, how they were, working the land and doing other sorts of things, the economic activities, these sorts of things, and even religious activities. So we also have other sources too. I mean, art and iconography and information from surrounding areas help inform our understanding. But I think it's really archaeology that's the most exciting here, because it's sort of, new discoveries are being made all the time. And, there's just so much to work with.
Women appear throughout the Bible. And through ancient times. Why did you decide to focus in on the role of women during biblical times?
So I became interested in food and drink technology when I was in graduate school. And so, in the region, it's a lot of, wine and olive oil and these sorts of things, sort of staple products that kind of loom large. in our understanding of ancient Israel. And I became focused more on grinding stones and things that were associated more with like grinding grain, mortars and pestles, grinding slabs, handstones. And these things are found all over the place in archaeological sites, in part because they're uniquely durable, and also because they were, essential for making the staple food, which was in ancient Israel and elsewhere in the region in antiquity, bread. So I started working on these things and, learning kind of different techniques for analyzing them. And I didn't really put together, until a few years later, the fact that, these are women's tools. I mean, all the information we have available to us, including, information in the biblical text, seems to indicate that women were the primary grinders and bakers of bread in ancient Israel. So that's how I came into it. I came into it through food technology. And only later, did I start to really realize that women were responsible for a lot of those technologies. I mean, maybe even developing them, maybe making the tools themselves, but certainly using them, sometimes, for hours a day to feed their families. So that's how I got to it.
What do we know about ovens? We've talked about grinding stones and pottery. Mm-hmm. Do we find these ancient ovens, and what were they like?
Yeah, what's so great about when you really look carefully at the archaeology of daily life is that most of what survives in the archaeological record, and that would be things made of stone and clay, they're really associated with everyday life and specifically women's activities, which is just so much fun when you think about it. It's like we have all of this material to work with that reflects on, what women were doing on a daily basis. And ovens are really important because they don't move around. So, you build an oven in place and it basically stays until, after you've repaired it a while, you decide to, destroy it and then rebuild an oven. And so we find scores of them. I mean, they're in, just about every house that's excavated from the Bronze and Iron Age in the region. Sometimes there's more than one. There could be one inside the house. There could be one outside in like a courtyard so that you could use them seasonally. And sometimes they're between houses. Sometimes they're sort of larger when they're outside, which may imply that they're being shared by multiple households. And so these things are upright, made of clay. The way that they baked bread in ancient Israel, as they did elsewhere in the region during that time, was they actually, through a hole in the top of the oven, they would insert these sort of flattened dough discs onto the inner walls. And you can still see this, method of baking in tandoors in some restaurants in the region. In Egypt, I remember seeing this when I was young, for the first time, and it was really exciting. And then they bake, and then you peel them off, and then you end up with this delicious, smoky, crusty, kind of flatbread.
How long do you think they spent going through this process of grinding to get the flour and the whole process? I mean, somebody who bakes bread at home, this is still, it's not an easy process. We have all kinds of mixers and we have other kinds of things, but still it takes time and it takes concentration. How much of their day were these women spending on that kind of activity?
Well, it seems that from ethnographic information that we have, that where people have gone out and documented, cases where people are using traditional sorts of technologies that can help us understand, the way those technologies were used in the distant past. It could be a few hours a day. I mean, to grind enough grain that's necessary to bake enough bread for family members in, like, say, a village, of the Iron Age period, an Israelite village. So I don't know, maybe 2 to 3 hours a day. And then the baking that I was able to witness in my ethnographic research in Jordan, that could take, well, yeah, I mean, you have to start out, if you want to, of course, put yeast in the dough in the morning, you have to let it rise and form it and all of that. But then after that, I mean, it could be another hour or two of baking. So, I mean, this really would have occupied, people, probably women and girls, 3 to 4 hours per day, most days.
Are there resources in addition to the Bible, secular texts, and visual imagery found in reliefs, sculptures, coins, or maybe even jewelry that contribute to your knowledge of the average day or the life of women in the Bible?
Yeah, I mean, there's some information. I mean, when it comes to things like the kind of mundane sorts of activities like cooking and baking, it seems that those things are less likely to be illustrated. I mean, I think that might be the same case, sort of cross-culturally, that we don't necessarily always, record the things that are sort of, everyday life sorts of activities that we see all of the time and we don't consider to be exceptional. So, I mean, a lot of what we have is really illustrating other aspects of life. And in other regions, I mean, I'm thinking Egypt in particular. I mean, they did invest a lot in artistic representations in 3 dimensions as well as on tomb walls of these sorts of activities, of technologies, of those associated with women and those that weren't. And a lot of that had to do with their beliefs about the afterlife. So since we don't have that, in Canaan and ancient Israel, apparently, I mean, we don't see those kinds of images so much. So we have to look to other sources, and especially this is where archaeology becomes really helpful to help us reconstruct some of those things.
As an archaeologist, and through all of the years of your work, what was the most satisfying find that you came across?
One of the early excavations that I participated in when I was a student was at Hatzor in the far north of Israel, which was a project that was a Hebrew University project then that had just gotten underway as a renewed excavation. And I was working in an area of an Iron Age gate. And we were expected to just sort of clear more of the gate so it could be better. I mean, sorry, it was a wall connected to the gate where I was working. So we could better understand the fortification system of that period. And we came down upon something made of a really nicely worked block of stone. And as we continued to excavate it, realized that we were on an olive press. And this was just really surprising. Like, why is there an olive press sitting here in the middle of this, fortification? And I found that really great because it was, something totally unexpected. And it threw a wrench into our excavations in that region because we had to slow down and look at it carefully and see all the other things that were associated with it and try to figure out, what it connected to. But that was probably the first, kind of exciting find that I made when I was a student, to find the unexpected and then have it relate to an interest of mine, already.
Yeah, you're talking about olive presses. Whenever I see an olive tree, whether it's in Israel or it's in Greece, there is something very, very eternal about an olive tree, knowing that this tree was producing its fruit for people in ancient times. And in that regard, what did the ancient Israelites eat and drink? What were they doing? We know from the Bible there are certain foods that are discussed, but what would the average day be like for eating 3 meals a day or whatever it is that they ate in those days?
Yeah, so it seems that they consumed sort of a traditional Mediterranean diet. I mean, based on what we know from all of the sources, as well as the climate in the area. So, a lot of the, getting down to kind of like patterns of consumption, like meals, that's a little bit harder to understand because we really are working with the textual sources to get a sense of those things. But it's believed that, they consume 2 or 3 meals per day. If we're talking about a kind of farming household, which, most people were farmers in ancient Israel, then and also the texts talk about this, and they may have taken some food out with them to the fields and then, taken a break at some point in the afternoon and eaten what they brought. But in terms of the actual diet, I mean, the staples were grain. So that would be wheat and barley. And so they, of course, transformed those into various things like bread, but also other grain-based kinds of foods like, porridges and stews and stuff, as well as beer and other, kind of fermented drinks that were made in part with grain. And then they also, of course, had olives and grapes. And, these things are seasonal. So, grapes are transformed into wine, which can be stored. And then olives may or may not have been eaten as olives. It's harder to say that than, that they were making them into olive oil to store because we just don't have so much evidence for it. So they also would have had, any kind of seasonal vegetables and fruits that were available at the time, any of those things that they could preserve in some way, which is tricky, to do that. And then they would have also had meat on occasion. I mean, meat that they'd perhaps hunted, or meat and dairy products from the animals that they owned. But that was probably really valuable and so consumed less frequently than one might expect.
Dates are native to the area. How important were dates in the diet of these folks?
Yeah, dates would have been really important because it was one of the sole sources of sweetness that was available to people in that region in antiquity. So those would have been, very valuable in season, and then also, of course, they can be dried and kept, for longer, as can figs and some other fruits as well. But dates, also can be fermented and turned into, added to or turned into a fermentable beverage or added to wine. So, dates were very valuable in that regard as well.
We've talked about women in baking bread, but what about brewing?
Yeah, so this is a little bit more, I guess, controversial because the biblical text doesn't say a whole lot to us about beer. And so it was long assumed that because wine was so important and it played such an important role, not only in, kind of commerce and culture, but also in, religious traditions from, early times, that it was, we're talking about a wine drinking culture. Or the Philistines, which we find out through early excavations, had these so-called beer jugs with sieves in them, for straining out the dregs, that the Philistines, these loutish, Philistine people, were associated with beer, while the Israelites were more cultured and, drank wine. And it turns out that that's probably not the case. It's just that, there's a lot more physical evidence for wine in archaeology. And it's only recently that archaeologists have been able to identify the residues of beer on vessels from that period. And so to confirm, that we actually do have physical evidence for beer. Before, it was just sort of assumed. Beer was extremely important in the neighboring civilizations. In Egypt and Mesopotamia, it was a staple. We know that people were paid in rations of bread and beer, for example, in Egypt and in Mesopotamia. So it appears that, a choice that a woman could make at home was to, create an alcoholic beverage. We're talking like a low alcohol content here. It could have other additives in it as well. And, you can do this within a week or 10 days or something like that. It takes, one vessel to ferment something in. And then you would create a much more nutrient rich and higher calorie product, from the stored grain that you've got on hand. And unlike grapes, which can't be stored, grain can be stored all year long and can be used to, brew something up, really quickly.
And because barley was plentiful, this would be a natural outgrowth of having barley at hand, correct?
Right. Since barley and wheat were the staple foods, really, that were probably this is being confirmed more and more by archaeological research, but until recently, it was more information coming from the textual sources. But yeah, wheat and barley were the primary agricultural products in ancient Israel, and so that's what people relied on.
How does an archaeologist determine, for example, we found the residue of beer or the residue of wine? How is that determined?
Well, there are all sorts of methods, and I'm not a specialist in that area. Some of it's visible. So, you can actually see the residue of wine, of tartaric acid, like the stain that sometimes remains, a sort of reddish purple stain inside of clay vessels. And so, vessels can be really permeable. So they really do, like cups and storage jars and juglets and things like that. They can really absorb that material for thousands of years, it turns out. There's other residues that are associated with beer and other fermented drinks, as well as other foods. You can actually find the remains of dairy products now using certain techniques. So this is a really understudied area when we're talking about the Iron Age Israel, because there's just been, a lot of assumptions about diet until relatively recently that, using the information that we have that some other regions don't have, since we do have a textual record in Israel to work with. So they're just, some of these studies are confirming what we thought we already knew. But then, of course, they're also shedding some really interesting light on things we hardly knew anything about. This is not directly related to food, but I'm just thinking about something that's been in the news the past few weeks, was a test that confirmed the presence of opium on juglets, from the late Bronze Age. And this is something that had been identified, a few decades ago in just a few isolated studies, but now a more careful and thorough study using more, sophisticated techniques has determined that, certain vessels that are shaped like poppies that people always assumed may have been used to transport opium around the Mediterranean actually did have the remains of opium inside of them. It's fascinating.
Yeah, your backdrop is of the Jezreel Valley in Israel. Tell us some details about your work in the Jezreel and what is this place known for? And do we read about it specifically in the Old Testament? And if we do, what's there?
Yeah, so the Jezreel Valley is a very lush and green area, as you can see behind me. Today it has fish ponds and lots of farmland. And I started a project with my partner, Norma Franklin, at the University of Haifa 10 years ago. And we did a survey of the area, and we went on to excavate until 2018. And we were attracted to the area for several reasons. I mean, for me personally, part of it had to do with the fact that the Jezreel Valley in general was considered a breadbasket in the ancient world, and Canaan and ancient Israel. It was a place that is it's a really unusual formation in the region, since it's the largest east-west valley, in the southern Levant. So it was really fertile, lots of springs, and so it attracted, a lot of people from, very, very early times to settle down. I mean, from the Neolithic period. So there had been previous excavations at the tell at the site, and we were interested in exploring some areas that were sort of off the tell, that were closer to the spring of Jezreel in the valley. And related to all of this is what the biblical text tells us about what happened in the Jezreel Valley and around the site of Jezreel in particular, and the story of Naboth's vineyard, and Ahab and Jezebel and all this, kind of gory things that went on at Jezreel as a result of that act of Jezebel's. That also speaks to the fertility of the area, the fact that grapes were grown there. This was known as a grape growing area. I mean, Naboth had a vineyard that King Ahab coveted, and the vineyard would have been in an area, that we can totally imagine at Jezreel. I mean, there are vineyards all over the place there today. And there would have been, wine presses located in that vineyard somewhere on the slopes of the site. And, we were really fortunate to actually identify a number of wine presses as well as olive presses during our survey and excavations of the area, which seemed to confirm, this idea that, those who wrote the story and, came up with the story of Naboth, were familiar with the fact that this was a wine producing area. So, we ended up excavating one of the larger known Iron Age wineries in the region. And it was just very exciting. I mean, to have students there and others who were working with us that season, it got some attention, more broadly. And it's a beautifully cut winery, out of limestone, no presses involved. So it was like, people were treading the grapes and fermenting it in vats that are still preserved, and then, bottling the wine and storing it probably in nearby caves and storage areas. So that was a really exciting opportunity for me to get more into, food and drink technology and, kind of go back to, what I was talking about before with one of my early discoveries, of a wine press, of an olive press. I mean, this is it's all sort of comes back to my early interest in food and drink.
Well, you mentioned students. The students are involved, and I know of many colleagues and classmates who went off on digs. How are they selected to accompany you to these digs? How does that work?
Yeah, a lot of excavations in Israel are really open to having, broad participation. So, I mean, excavations are, except for the ones that are sponsored by the Israeli Antiquities Authority, are often sponsored by one or more universities. So an Israeli university and then a foreign partner, so an American or European institution. And so often it's populated by student volunteers or team members, undergraduate or graduate, who want to spend part of the season in the field. And then also for the Jezreel project, we recruited from a number of institutions here and in Europe, but then also we were happy to take enthusiasts, people who'd been on digs before or maybe had never been on a dig before, folks who were maybe in their retirement years and wanted the experience of being on a dig for a couple of weeks. And it's great. I mean, it was great to have a much, a more diverse, range of participants. Digs are not all what you think, because I think a lot of people imagine, shovels and picks and wheelbarrows, and that's archaeology, but that's a part of it. I mean, there's also a lot of more delicate work. There's also a lot of indoor work, laboratory work and, cleaning and cataloging and registering things. So, I mean, there's a lot for people to do regardless, of ability. I mean, just about anyone can participate in an excavation. And so, I'm thinking about, the last couple of years have been difficult because of COVID and there have been restrictions, and not so many excavations have gone out there in full force. But I mean, it looks like next season is going to be a boom season, from what I can tell, for excavations in Israel. So there's a lot of opportunities for people to volunteer.
Well, let me ask you, because you mentioned that it's not just wheelbarrows and picks and shovels. We're living in the internet age, and yet, which affects everything that we do. And yet, what you do is in the ground, and a computer can't bring it out of the ground. But in that regard, how has the latest technology helped to change and improve archaeology?
Yeah, so archaeology has changed a great deal actually in recent decades because of technological developments, as well as the really unfortunate reality that cultural historical sites are under threat all the time. I mean, not only by war, but also by developers. So a lot of the archaeological work that is done in this country, in the United States, for example, is done because of development projects. Where we need to do salvage excavations to try to save whatever resources are there before they're gone. One thing that archaeologists are kind of moving more toward is excavating less and doing more with what we find, doing more with less. And this is, we think that generally archaeologists think that this is a good thing because it's preserving these things in the ground for the future when there are even better techniques that we'll have to work with to preserve material. The archaeological resources are, ultimately they are finite, but we've barely scratched the surface, even on major, sites in Israel. Like I'm thinking, for example, just down the valley from us is Megiddo, which has been excavated, time after time in all of these different projects. But still, only a relatively small portion of that site has been excavated and studied. So, there's still a lot left to work with in the future. There's a lot more focus on surveys. And, one of the things that we did before we went out and did a traditional sort of foot survey at the site was we did a LiDAR scan of this part of the Jezreel Valley. And what LiDAR does, in a nutshell, is it strips away all the vegetation. So you can actually create a 3D model that gives you like the topography of the area. And so, one of the things that is really useful, I think, about seeing this kind of aerial image of the Jezreel Valley is that you can see really clearly that there's lots of plants, there are trees, there's, weeds, there's all sorts of things, planted fields. And when we went out on our survey on foot, you can't see where you're walking on, everything is just overgrown. In some cases, we had weeds, above our heads. So the LiDAR model really allowed us to see the site in a way that you can't do in person. So, there is a degree of research that we can do on the computer now that couldn't be done before. We're using that LiDAR model for all sorts of work going forward and learning things about the site that we could never learn just from excavating it or surveying it in person.
So final question, what are your next projects going to be?
Thank you. Yeah, for asking that. One of the things that I'm real concerned with and focused on is completing the work on the project at Jezreel. So there's a unfortunate history in archaeology generally, but also in Israeli archaeology in particular, for archaeologists to do all this great work. It's very fun and interesting and sexy and gets a lot of attention, this field work. But then there's a delay in getting everything analyzed and published, and sometimes excavations can take decades for the final report to be produced. And so that's one of my priorities, is trying to move this forward, working with a team of specialists and others, who are analyzing and writing up this material to get that out in the next couple of years. So a couple other things around the edges are happening, but that's my focus, because I'd really like to the longer you wait on something like this, the harder it gets. And I know this from talking to colleagues and seeing, their experience. So, everything just gets more difficult the more distant you are from the work, right? So that's my priority. After that, we'll see what happens. There are lots of other sites and projects, to investigate, and hopefully I can work with other teams going forward at some other sites.
Well, there's thousands of years of history lying under our feet. Every time we walk through the land of Israel. And we wish you the best on the Jezreel project and everything else that follows.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate this.
Well, Jennie, thank you for guiding us through your findings, helping us dig into life in biblical times. We're excited to see, as I said, what's next for you. And thank you again to University of Evansville professor Jennie Ebeling for her insights into life in ancient times and the archaeological work behind it. And thank you for tuning into this conversation with B'nai B'rith. If you enjoyed this interview, make sure you tune into all of our programs by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and by liking us on Facebook. And sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our important work, including our efforts supporting Ukrainian refugees, as well as those still within Ukraine's borders more than 7 months into the war. For my guest, Jennie Ebeling, and for B'nai B'rith, I'm Dan Mariaschin. Join us again soon.